Prosecutors say the assassination of United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson is inspiring other acts of violence, just as the suspect Luigi Mangione intended. In a recent court filing, prosecutors point to the deadly shooting at the National Football League's headquarters as an example. Let's bring in Dmitriy Shakhnevich, a criminal defense attorney, to talk about this. Thank you so much for a little bit of your time on this holiday weekend. We greatly appreciate it. And I want to get to the point of intention that the prosecutors are making in this case. Will this matter in his trial?
So it's designed really for the sentencing phase, for the death penalty phase. In other words, why do certain defendants get the death penalty as opposed to a life sentence? There must be some aggravating factor shown. In other words, future dangerousness, right? Whether or not this defendant, even incarcerated, poses some aggravated threat to the public. And these days, between the internet and social media and who knows what will come with AI, right? It's far easier to pose a threat to the public via all those platforms. And so the government is relying on that to make this kind of sentencing death penalty argument.
Yeah, and the prosecutors have pointed to writings that Mangione left behind, as well as the things that they say he wrote on the bullets: deny, delay, depose, all terms associated with the insurance industry and denial of care. In the most recent filing, they write this: simply put, the defendant hoped to normalize the use of violence to achieve ideological or political objectives. Since the murder, certain quarters of the public who openly identify as acolytes of the defendant have increasingly begun to view violence as an acceptable or even necessary substitute for reasoned political disagreement. Is the argument here that this goes beyond simple murder and that it moves into an area, something along the lines of incitement?
Molly, I'll tell you this. I was coming back from court to my office last week. As I was passing by a crowded area in downtown Manhattan, there was a gentleman, likely in his 30s, dressed as Luigi Mangione with a sign. He was being filmed by a single camera in the production of some version of a low-budget biopic. In other words, this is a real thing. And it's not a new thing, but again, with the advent of all these platforms, this is essentially what's going to happen in terms of the proceedings at sentencing, right? The argument is that this defendant poses a future danger to the public.
Yeah, and there's a major concern about copycats in this case. Mangione, as we've noted here, he's facing trial. He survived, and he has these people that are lifting him up in a heroic sort of way. And they point specifically to a shooter they believe was inspired directly by Mangione. They're in Manhattan, not so far away, where 4 people were killed very, very recently. And they write this about that shooter. I won't say his name, but the argument they say that he left behind a piece of evidence for investigators to find, blaming the NFL and football for causing chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Almost immediately, members of the public sympathetic to the defendant touted this shooter's actions as the laudable continuation of the defendant's philosophy. When they can point to a specific case like this shooter that targeted the NFL headquarters here in Manhattan, not far from the original shooting of Brian Thompson, does that make a difference?
Absolutely, because think about it. So many of the parallels here show themselves. Again, you mentioned the location, the time, you mentioned some of the conduct outside of the primary act by the shooter that went into the NFL headquarters. So I don't want to say it's an easy argument to make, but it's an argument that lines up in terms of the timing and in terms of all those other special events that took part. And again, it helps the prosecution. It will help the prosecution moving forward in various ways. And sentencing and the death penalty and the fact that this is a capital case is just one of those ways.
Dmitry Shakhnevich, a great point there, most likely to have impact in that phase 2 of any potential outcome. Thank you very much for your thoughts today. Appreciate it. Griff?
Meanwhile, millions